In April of 1999, Marie Colvin was pinned down with some Kosovo Liberation Army regulars on the Albanian border. She wrote, "The Kosovo Liberation Army held the high ground, but little else. KLA regulars, armed only with Russian-made rifles and a mortar on a spindly tripod, huddled together as Serbian artilleries shelled their positions. Shards of hot metal from exploding shells tore into earth, stone, and flesh alike." She was there. Colvin's stories are vivid because there's no distance between her and those she covers. She eats and sleeps and lives as they do. Marie Colvin is brave, but it's bravery with a purpose. She covers headline-making stories, but she covers them from the point of view of those least able to capture media attention. I wonder how many journalists, if we were honest with ourselves, would take the risks that she takes. For most of us, one war, perhaps two, in a lifetime would be enough. But for Marie, covering war is a lifestyle. She has pulled away from journalism's pack. It is her independence that gives her the means to bring us important stories. Obviously, she's a woman of extraordinary courage. And in a strange way, she is also our conscience, prodding us always to remember that in every bloody conflict, it's the innocent, the weak, and the powerless who really pay. I'm proud to present the International Women's Media Foundation's Courage in Journalism Award to Marie Colvin.
Thank you very much. Very honored to be here. You have to bear with me. I broke my glasses on the way here, actually. I'm very honored to receive this award. But I have to say, I'm also very honored to be on the stage with, and I think I should start with this, two people like Samira and Agnes. I mean, I've been shot at, bombed, arrested, you know, you name it. That comes with doing this job. But I have an American passport. I'm a war correspondent who works for the Sunday Times. And when I go home, I'm safe. And it's terrifying. But Samira and Agnes have to live with these horrors day in and day out. They're in danger day in and day out. And they're never safe, and they don't give up. And I think that's really courage, and I applaud that. I'm also honored to be here with Flora Lewis. Flora took me under her wing when I was just starting out in Paris. I thought I was a young foreign correspondent, and she taught me the skill of drinking martinis, vodka martinis. And I thought, you know, hey, invite out sources, drink martinis. I can do this job. I was very enthusiastic, in fact. Then Flora, in that gravelly, no-nonsense voice, told me, "Marie, the point is, you have to remember the next morning what people have told you." Flora is rigorous, she's fierce, she's wholly committed to the truth, and she's always been an inspiration to me, and I'm very glad to be here with her as well. I think it's fitting, I almost didn't make it here. About 48 hours ago, I was breathing in tear gas, which just makes you cry, hiding behind this concrete wall and really hoping it wouldn't crumble under the power of the bullets that were being fired my way. I was in Ramallah on the West Bank. I was on my way to see a Palestinian friend I'd met 10 years ago in Baghdad. Actually, I was then being bombed by my own country. Later in the day, I did finally make it to my friend's house, and it was a heartbreaking moment. He'd come back, he was a Palestinian who lived abroad, and he'd come back to try to build a state. And you know, here we were sitting in his house, listening to the sounds of gunfire. He was upset because his nephew was a young, very sensitive boy, had left that morning to try to trade his 2 guitars for a gun. And it was awful that, you know, in this situation, it's not the gunfire, it's that a whole nother generation could be lost. I find this, and I know I won't dwell on this, but I find this one of the hardest conflicts to write about. It's emotive, it's politically charged. It's very hard to watch Israeli soldiers firing guns at teenagers. Israel was created in 1948 as an exemplar to the world. You know, that a people who had been so persecuted would try to build, it was a wonderful thing, would try to build a state. It was different, it was idealistic. It's an elusive dream. Thankfully, I have Israeli friends who are as horrified by what is happening there as I was, crouching under gunfire, talking to my friend, watching children die. And I still believe both sides will find a way to a just peace. My vocation seems to have been, or maybe always been, or certainly is now, to go to places torn by chaos, by destruction. And I think what's important is not being there, but trying to bear witness. I've never been that interested. I don't think it's the most important thing is the politics of war, or what kind of toys are being used. I have never been able to figure out the difference between the profile of a battleship or a destroyer, or whether this thing shooting at people is a MiG or a tornado, or what caliber gun has just been fired into that village. I care about and I really care about the experience of those most directly affected by war. Those are people who asked to fight, and mostly those are people who are just trying to survive. Despite all the videos you see on television from NATO or from Pentagon briefings, whatever, about precision bombs, through the years, certainly long before I started covering wars, what's on the ground remains remarkably the same. Craters, buried houses, bombed houses, women weeping, dead children, suffering. The pain of war is really beyond telling. I don't think I've ever filed a story and felt I got it. You know, I really said what I want people to feel, but I do try. And I think whatever the rights and wrongs of a conflict, I feel we fail if we don't face what war does, face the human horrors, rather than just record who won and who lost. In my profession as a war correspondent, there doesn't seem to be any chance of unemployment. My strongest memory of East Timor is walking through that besieged compound and being stared at with fear, and just people going quiet as I walked through that compound. By all the women and children and we were all just kind of sleeping under palm trees and pretty quickly running out of food and water. I was sleeping under a palm tree. But they knew, they looked at me and they were staring at me in that way because they knew if I was still there, they had a chance to live, and if I left, they would probably die. I was kind of a human shield. It was an incredible burden. The compound was besieged by militiamen, machetes, guns. I'd seen them kill people. I'd had to be evacuated from a hotel. They'd killed people next to me. And this compound was likely to be overrun at any moment. No one in it was armed. And the UN did indeed decide to evacuate, leaving, and the idea was to evacuate local staff, but to leave these 1,500 women and children behind. They would die, and I knew this. They all had brothers or cousins who had worked for the UN as translators or drivers. And I have to say, it was a moment that really tested any idea of thinking of myself as a brave person, but I did decide to stay. My journalist colleagues and I made a decision, and I don't think you can ever question someone's decision. It's very personal. But my journalist colleagues made a decision to get out on the last flight, so I was there alone, and that's why I was being stared at. I stayed, and I reported to anyone I could, CNN and BBC, American channels, that the UN evacuation, if followed through, was a death sentence for these women and children. It was a terrifying couple of days. They were shooting into the compound, guys with machetes were trying to come in at night. But 3 days later, the UN reversed its decision and evacuated not only local staff and me, but all 1,500 women and children. And I thought journalism can make a difference. It's not in vain. With Kosovo, I think a lot of the war in Kosovo was covered, again, through sort of videos, and it all looks really nice when you can watch precision bombings. But as Mike was saying, I went in with the Kosovo Liberation Army. These were, people who 2 months ago had been shoe salesmen in New York or in a market in London. They were from all over the world, and they'd come back to fight. And about villagers who were under Serbian gunmen. It's not something I could have reported from briefings in Brussels. And I walked into Kosovo over the mountains and reported on a real ragtag forest, but with heart. They were fighting in World War I conditions. Mud, cold, it was really cold, and there was a lot of mud. Firefights in the forest. We were under constant bombardment from the artillery. And in villages I found mass graves, and there was always someone who remained alive, would come out of hiding and tell the story of their dead neighbors. Chechnya, again, I made a decision that the war in Chechnya could not be reported from the Russian side. I traveled into Chechnya with the Chechens from Georgia. And the war I wanted to report was the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, which was not being reported. I remember an old man who was lying on a bed in a basement. I was actually taking shelter there. And his skull had cracked. The Russians had bombed this village that morning. His wife just sat there. He was still breathing somehow. He was clearly going to die, but his wife just sat here holding his hand. There were no doctors, there was no medicine, there hadn't been electricity for months, there'd been no food. But she just was going to stay there till he died. Another village outside Grozny, a woman just sat in a destroyed house, and I holding on her lap 2 little boys. They were her sons. They were her only children. Her husband was already dead. Again, Russian planes had come that morning. Every single bombing and artillery barrage that was reported as an attack on the terrorists. I was there. It was on villages. These were the people it affected. You saw the pictures. I wasn't very good at getting out of there. But on my way, trying to get out, after my car was hit, managed to get my satellite phone, not my computer out, but my satellite phone. And I was pinned down in this snowy field and absolutely no cover because it's winter and the trees are very bare, and the Russian planes came back over and over, and it's terrifying. It was 12 hours. They came back every hour, and there would be silence, and you'd hear the stream, and then you'd hear the buzz of the planes coming back. So I was pinned down for 12 hours, but I was very humbled because I found this experience terrifying. And yet, Chechen villagers who stayed, mostly the poor, because they were the only people who couldn't get out, they did that day after day after day, and that's courage. I often do find that I'm the only journalist on a story. I very much respect the decision of other news organizations to do it differently. I think any conflict has to be reported from all sides. Anyone makes their own decision. But for me, going to these places and finding out what is happening on the ground, the people it's affecting, not the sort of make of the bomb that it's being dropped on them, is the only way to get at the truth. And I think getting at the truth is why we all entered journalism. It's not perfect. It's kind of a rough draft of history. But historians can come later. I do think the phrase I used earlier, we have to bear witness, and that it can make a difference. I don't really know exactly where I'm going next, but I'll try to take that commitment with me. And thank you very much for being here.